So we saw a nice expert talk now, so we get back to our beginner's talk. Because I thought I'm doing a talk about Elm, I thought I'd try to do the talk actually in Elm, so to write it in Elm. Because I actually wanted to include an interactive component which I could show you. And then I tried Elm slides, and then I noticed that the interactiveness is probably not working. But, well, let's see. At least it's in Elm. It's cool. So the talk was titled as Productive Elm as a Beginner, which is a bit misleading because I'm not talking about efficiency. I'm actually talking about an Elm application in production, and which we developed as complete Elm beginners. And I will talk a bit about how that worked out for us. So actually Noel and me were starting the project in Elm. And I will tell you a bit about how it worked. So we are both working for a simplificator. We are mostly doing Rails apps, and we mostly do the good old request-response cycle. So we're not doing that much. I mean, we're not doing single-page applications. We are not doing that much JavaScript. I mean, where it makes sense, we use it, but it's not that we mainly do JavaScript or Elm or whatever. So, and then at some point we had a drink, and then Freddie was praising Elm, how great it is, and we had a new project in the line, and we thought, okay, let's use Elm. But to me it was clear from the beginning that if you use Elm, I mean, I didn't know Elm at all. It was 3 months ago. And I thought I'm not going to create a single page application in Elm because the risk is too high. If it doesn't work out, I have to reprogram everything. So we decided that we use Elm just for certain interactive components, so where it actually makes sense. And the most part of our application is still Rails. So that was 3 months ago. That was our first Elm commit at Simplificator, and we now have about 2,000 lines of code in Elm. It's probably, I'm not so experienced in Elm, but for Elm that's probably quite little, because Elm is quite verbose, right, on the lines. Yeah, and what's the bottom line? In the beginning, it took us much longer to actually develop stuff, because we had no clue. And most of the times we were reading compiler error messages, and they're quite nice. I mean, if you ever did C++, then I mean, you love Elm compiler, because most of the times it really tells you what you have to do. Sometimes it still gets confused and writes an error message where you think like, okay, I mean, there's nothing wrong with that part you're highlighting, but somewhere else something is wrong. So I really got to love the Elm compiler. It's really great. And I saw that in other projects where we were using JavaScript, and we went to the client and demoed our code, and then we clicked the button and nothing happened. So we checked the console and there was a JavaScript error. So it probably happens, you know, if you start merging your code 5 minutes before the demo with the client. Things like that are going to happen. And with Elm, I mean, we never had that problem, because if the compiler is not complaining, then everything just works. I will come back to that point later. What we also noticed that Elm is still lacking maturity, and that is sometimes difficult if you're actually developing for a client who doesn't have that much money. So you actually have to really count your hours. Then sometimes with jQuery and JavaScript, you're just much faster than with Elm, right? Because in Elm, maybe the module is not around, and in JavaScript there is a module for doing this stuff you want to do, and then you have to do it on your own. And especially, I will also talk about that if you're trying to integrate Elm into Rails. It seems that we're the only ones who are doing that. I don't know.
Lorelink is doing that.
Ah, okay. So probably you have to give me the cool tools you have.
That's Noah.
So that was actually basically my talk, and now I'm just randomly talking about things I noticed. And maybe, I mean, you can help me out in a couple of things here. So that what I already talked about. I mean, undefined is not a function, is the common JavaScript that we always have, and with Elm you don't have that. So I really got to love that. However, after that, you know, in the beginning, if you're learning Elm, you're really coping with all those error messages you get from the compiler, and you're trying to figure out the right syntax and the right structure, and especially functional programming is also new to you. You're also coping with that. And then it works, right? And then you think, like, at some point, you start to think, okay, if the Elm compiler is not complaining, then my software is working. And then there are the logical errors you do during programming. So that was one. I'm more like a back-end developer, and that was one thing I had to learn in the front end, which is quite a simple thing. Let's say you have a model with some string, right? And we had a lot of, we had a couple of Elm components, I have to say, because they're really UI components we use Elm for, right? So our application is basically Rails, and then somewhere we have a box, and that box is just plain Elm. So let's say in that box we have some data, we display an edit button. So you click that edit button, and then you get an input field, so it just changes to an input field, right? And then the user types in something in that input field, and we just, with non-input event, we update the model, right? And then you click on submit, and it switches back to your view, showing the edit button, and the data is actually updated, right? Working out nicely. And then someone has the idea that he or she clicks on the cancel button. And unfortunately, you lost the state, right? Because you overrode the state when the user was typing in the input field. So that was something to learn from me, that because if you're just doing plain Rails, you click a button and you have a request-response cycle, and you don't care about state at all in the front end. And now that you have state, you actually have to store that dirty form state. When the user is actually changing data, you have to store separately, and then if you click cancel, you just have to throw it away. Right? So I think there's still a lot more front-end, like, architecture things I have to learn before things like that to work on. Another thing are the case statements in Elm. It's like, one of my coworkers said, like, one disadvantage of Elm is that you cannot just quickly hack something together and just play around with it, but you have to be perfect because the compiler enforces it. So let's say you're parsing some string in a case statement. I'm not sure if that's actually the correct way to do it in Elm, but let's just assume you can do it like that. And because, I mean, you always need a default case, right, in such a case statement, because the string could be anything. Now, however, you as a programmer think, okay, the value we put into that function here, into that case statement, we get that back from an API. And it's a finite set of values, right? So it's either bold or zero, and it will never be any other value. So in the default case, you just take the first value of your union type, for example, which is gold here. And then you deploy and everything's working fine and the compiler is happy. And then at some point, let's say you use that to parse the value of a select box. And then at some point, your select box is reverting its value to gold. And you don't know why. And you have to search the bug. And then at some point, you realize that apparently, you thought that the only values were those two strings, but apparently there are other values too, which will end up in that function. And then just gold is true. In that case, I mean, I don't really know what to do here now. I mean, of course, you can return a maybe, but I mean, then you have to handle the maybe everywhere in your code, which is also quite cumbersome. So in that sense, in my opinion, the problem makes sense just to do a debug crash, and then we would have found the error earlier. But as I can see, maybe you have different opinions of that.
It's the price of correctness that you need to have a maybe, yes, or a crash.
So probably then the way to go is maybe.
If you can handle it.
Yeah.
If you can't, then you might as well crash.
Yeah. It depends. If you have a production app and you have it set up so that you get informed straight away when it crashes, then maybe that's better.
Yeah.
I think if you're building a larger app, probably you will have some kind of system to handle whatever errors you didn't expect, right? That you can show generic, something went wrong.
Yeah.
You've been alerted of the fact, and you probably trigger that from this code.
Yes.
So it's definitely a code smell, and if that's something you get from an API, that should be handled in JSON code, and anyway you have to fail because maybe the JSON is broken from the backend,
Yeah.
but it should be there. If this is in the middle of your code, it's probably a code smell,
Yeah, that's true.
and probably your state is not, or your model is not correct.
Yeah.
But it doesn't have to be.
No, it's
Most
probably
of the
true.
time.
Yeah.
Or it should be a maybe, and that's actually not that hard if you get used to it. It's actually pretty easy.
I think, my last point is about Rails and Elm. We tried to use a gem called Elm Rails, and it was a kind of a old gem. I think it hasn't been updated for in a year. And it wasn't working with Rails 5 as well, so we used a fork, and the fork was also not working in all the cases. So we forked the fork, and that is our fork we use in our production app, and that kind of feels wrong already, right? So we're using our own fork. Yeah, and don't really believe that this is how you have to do it. And one big problem we noticed last week was that Elm gem is actually, the Elm Rails gem, is actually doing an Elm compiler call for every Elm module you import or you embed. And what that means is that because the Rails asset pipeline puts all those files together in the end, it means that you cannot use the same model in different embedded modules, because then you will get name clash. Because Elm if you call Elm compiler, Elm thinks like, I'm the only one here. And it puts everything into the window variable, right? All the modules. And if you do another Elm compiler call and try to use those two JavaScripts you get into the same HTML page, that won't work. You use the same modules. And because, that's just how the Rails asset pipeline works. It just pushes everything into one JavaScript file you use everywhere. And yeah, I implemented a hack yesterday evening to just do one Elm compiler call, and then everything works fine. But it's probably not the best solution. I also started a Git book, Elm on Rails. It's virtually empty, more or less. So if you want to contribute and help us out here, feel free.
I think it's going to be easier with Rails 5.1. There's support for packaging application-style JavaScript.
Yeah. Okay.
With
Okay.
Webpack and stuff, and because there's Elm Web, I don't use Webpack, but I think there's
Yeah, we
tooling
use
around this.
Webpack.
So
Okay.
I think it will work out of the box.
Okay. Cool. Okay.
But we also used it before Webpack.
Yeah. Okay.
Webpack and out of the box are not really two terms.
True. So last question, would I use it again? Would I use Elm again in the project? And I'm really unsure about that, honestly. Because, I really love the functional paradigm. I really love the compiler. But if I have to count hours for a client, then at least as an Elm beginner, maybe that changes if you're an expert. But as an Elm beginner, it's probably with JavaScript, it's much easier. And you're much quicker. But then again, you have all those errors and all the tests you cannot write in JavaScript, because testing JavaScript is also not it doesn't really feel good. It's not like Ruby tests, which actually feel good.
I respect.
Yeah, that would have been everything from me. Any questions?
So what would convince you to give a qualified yes to the answer that you're asking yourself here?
Probably just more modules. More, out of the box. Like, we had a basic backend application, right, with all the stuff like tables, and then you had to sort the tables, and you had to filter the tables. And I saw there was a sortable table example somewhere, but probably you couldn't search in that, right? And then we needed to implement that on our own, and also to select rows, we probably had to implement on our own. you know, you can use just a JavaScript data table to plug in, and then you have everything out of the box. But I think that, I mean, it's kind of, it's the same problem again, right? I mean, if you have a lot of people, if you have a big community, you have all those modules. And if people say, okay, you don't have enough out-of-the-box modules, well, I mean, if there are more people working on it, you will have more modules. And if you compare the history of Elm and JavaScript, I mean, it's clear that JavaScript has a big community.
So one recommendation. So what we do if something is missing, sometimes, like for example for the date picker, we just use JavaScript or React. We use even React for some parts of our application. It's not that hard to interrupt. I get that as a beginner it's not easy, but usually after a few months you are more than capable to do that. And there are examples of how to interrupt with React or jQuery or whatever.
But can you actually, I mean, if you're writing an Elm view, can you actually integrate some input field and call JavaScript on it? Yes.
You cannot call just like JavaScript. You have to talk over a port and render your stuff into a div or something. And there is a great talk from Richard Feldman at the ReactConf in Vienna from a couple of weeks ago, where he talked about web components and Elm, which integrate even better than React, which is great. You can just encapsulate something that is not supported to Elm in web component. And I know from someone who works in Germany that they built an app for maps with OpenLayer and so on, and they used OpenLayers and just wrapped that into a web component and defined a nice API for both sides.
Okay.
So I think that's the best solution for now.
How do you solve the issue that you can't really tell when Elm actually inserts the element?
You can define keys on a view. So there's HTML key where you can give Elm a hint that something didn't update and it should keep rendering the same thing.
Okay.
More or less.
And it's more like the issue is usually that you cannot tell when Elm actually rendered a div, so you can tell your JavaScript to actually start inserting things.
You can use a mutation observer to watch when the element arrives.
Okay.
By
You want to do it that way?
Yeah, but it's messy, but it works.
Okay. So be it.
There were some requests for some events for when things are added.
Yeah, there is you can now listen to request animation for it.
For an on-node added event?
No, it's animation with. Is it an animation? I don't know. But it's request animation frame, which is basically when something got rendered. You know that.
Okay.